Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
In the year 2000, Christopher Halliwell was granted a licence to drive a taxi, despite having a criminal record. He would go on to commit 2 murders, although it is believed he is responsible for many more. He used his taxi as a front to lure vulnerable women into his vehicle. Another high-profile perpetrator would come to light in 2016, when taxi driver John Warboys was convicted of multiple rapes, which he had perpetrated against passengers in his black cab over a 6-year period. These high-profile cases, combined with many other incidents reported throughout the country, led to calls for more stringent regulations regarding the licensing of taxi drivers. It is mandatory that all applicants and licence holders have health and criminal record checks. However, it is up to the local authorities' discretion to determine whether the individual may pose a risk to the public, and therefore people with a criminal record may still be granted a licence. This is something campaigners are fighting hard to change, advocating for more stringent and uniformed regulations to avoid anyone slipping through the net. Alongside regulations on taxi drivers, there are also restrictions on the type of taxis who can collect fares without advanced bookings. Private hire vehicles are not insured to collect passengers who haven't pre-booked. If a driver is caught, they may be prosecuted for driving without insurance. This has helped reduce the number of unlicensed taxis, or people posing as taxi drivers, collecting passengers from the curbside. Sadly, there are still cases in which this occurs, often involving individuals who are vulnerable due to being intoxicated. Therefore, their inhibitions are lowered, meaning they are more likely to take risks, or believe that a vehicle is a genuine taxi. One initiative which was started in Halifax in 2005 is the Street Angels Project, whose goal is to help those who are out at night, from people drinking to those who live on the streets. Their aim is to offer support and guidance. Amongst all the great work they do, is to help monitor taxi ranks, ensuring that vulnerable people are not getting into unlicensed vehicles. With all these measures to protect passengers, the question is, who is there to protect the driver? As of 2021, there were 343,800 licensed taxi drivers in England, many of whom are self-employed, working long shifts, often working into the early hours when trains and bus services have ended. They too can be vulnerable, but there is no way for them to know who they are letting into their vehicle. Time and again, there are news stories regarding drivers being attacked. So when I first sat down to write this episode, I had a single case in mind. However, as I dove into the research, I felt I needed to report the other stories I had come across, as they highlight an underreported spate of attacks perpetrated against individuals just trying to make a living. Many of these stories only made the local news. However, the impact of these incidents have far-reaching consequences, and ignited questions about how safe our taxi drivers are, as well as shining a light on the darker side of humanity. Every year, hundreds of drivers report being assaulted by fare dodgers or individuals who have been consuming alcohol or taking drugs. Many of these drivers suffer serious injuries that result in hospitalisation and extended time off work. For some, the consequences are far worse, as was the case in the early hours of Saturday the 19th of December 1992. 31-year-old Ghulam Hussain was nearing the end of his long night shift. Driving his Vauxhall Cavalier taxi through the streets of Middlesbrough, he had time for one more fare. At approximately 4 a.m, he pulled up to the curb to collect his next passengers, 24-year-old Paul Smith and his 19-year-old nephew, Stephen Elcourt, who had been attending a party. The details on what followed have not been fully disclosed. However, at some point the older of the two men, Paul Smith, became agitated and allegedly refused to pay the £4 fare. It was at that point an altercation took place at the roadside between Paul and Ghulam, during which the taxi driver was stabbed, bundled into the boot of his car, and the two men proceeded to drive away, believing Guillem was deceased. However, bloody handprints discovered on the boot lid suggested to investigators that the 31-year-old was fully conscious while in the cramped and dark space, from where he had frantically fought to escape. Realizing that he was still alive, the two men proceeded to drag the stricken man from the vehicle, forcing him onto an isolated stretch of wasteland beside an industrial estate, where the uncle and his nephew set upon Guillem. A security guard would testify in court that he believed that the two men were punching and kicking the defenceless 31-year-old. However, it would later emerge that the punches were actually knife thrusts. Unconscious and bleeding profusely from 52 stab wounds, Guillem was clinging to life when police arrived. They had been called by the security guard who had witnessed the assault. His quick action resulted in Paul Smith being apprehended close to the scene. Unfortunately, the swift response of the emergency services was not enough to save the father of three's life. The field in which he took his last breath was just 500 metres away from the home where his wife and children were sleeping. Following his arrest, 24-year-old Paul Smith admitted his involvement in the crime. However, his 19-year-old nephew, Stephen Elcourt, denied being present, claiming he had been babysitting. At the trial in October 1993, both men were found guilty. From what I was able to find out, Paul was sentenced to 20 years and was eligible for parole in 2012. As for Stephen, he was ordered to serve a minimum term of 14 years. In 2003, he appealed this, but his request was denied, with the judge highlighting that although he had been a model inmate, his failure to admit guilt or demonstrate remorse was a barrier to his term being reduced. Ghulam Hussain lost his life at the hands of two men who, under the influence of drink and drugs, launched a vicious attack on a man who was simply doing his job, all because they refused to pay a £4 fare. Like Ghulam, it would be the refusal to pay the fare that would end the life of Tariq Javid, who was killed in October 2000, all because his drunken passengers didn't want to pay £2 for their journey. 48-year-old Tariq Javid came from a large family. He was one of 6 brothers, and was also a father of 2 daughters and 2 sons. Described as a hard-working man whose world revolved around his family and his love of pigeons, which he bred and raced. His brother, Asif, stating, quote, "My brother was a very jolly person and very hard-working. He didn't spend much time going out. Work and home, that was his life." Those who knew him best stated that he was the kind of person who would walk away from a confrontation, even if it meant not being paid, which only made the brutality of his death even harder to comprehend. Tariq left his home on Richard Birch Street in Bury on the 9th of October 2000, with the intention of having a good day ferrying passengers around the Greater Manchester area in his Toyota Carina taxi. Just before 6 p.m, he had collected a group of men who had been celebrating their friend, Mark Baker's 21st birthday. They were in high spirits as they climbed into the taxi. The men requested to be taken to Alder Avenue in Bury, a typical post-war Manchester street, set amongst a housing estate. It was lined with red brick semi-detached houses along one side, while on the other towered the grey concrete walls of the M66 motorway flyover. It was here that Tariq was dragged from the driver's seat of his vehicle. Within seconds, the father of 4 was lying upon the ground, crying out in pain as he was set upon by 2 of his 3 passengers. They struck him with a series of blows from feet and fists, an attack that would later be described as vicious, cowardly, and disgraceful, which became even more horrific as the perpetrators climbed into the Toyota, with witnesses believing that they had reversed it over the stricken man. This was later to be clarified at court, with prosecutor Anthony G. QC stating that it was unlikely the car had driven over the unconscious man. However, it was possible he was dragged along beneath it. As the car disappeared from the scene, people who had heard the commotion raced to assist Tariq. Amongst them was a 15-year-old girl, who told the court she had entered the road and described seeing Tariq already on the ground with a man, later identified as 21-year-old Mark Baker, hunched over him. As Baker made his way to the driver's side of the taxi, the teenager observed a second man continue to kick Tariq, before removing the badly injured man's coat and joining his accomplice. Upon seeing the vehicle being reversed towards the unconscious man, the teenager described how she looked away, not wanting to see the victim being run over by the car. But as the vehicle sped away, she raced to Tariq's side and attempted to comfort him. There was, however, little neither she nor the emergency services could do to save Tariq's life, as the 46-year-old was declared dead at the scene. During the subsequent post-mortem, it was determined that Tariq Javid had suffered multiple serious injuries resulting in fractures to the skull and ribs. He also had bruising and trauma that confirmed that the victim had been stamped on and kicked numerous times. Following the murder, the three men, Mark Baker, Jason Power and David Hawkins, drove the taxi 1.5 miles away to Fairfield Hospital, where the vehicle was set alight in a car park. A large police operation began to search for the culprits, with investigators confirming that they were treating the incident as a racially motivated attack. The murder sparked outrage in the community, particularly amongst taxi drivers, who had for years been complaining about the lack of safety measures in place for people in their profession. During a report by The Guardian, journalist David Ward spoke to drivers who reported to him that they had experienced assaults, robberies and fare dodgers, with their fears now heightened in the light of Tariq's death. Their sentiments regarding the risks they faced were echoed by Superintendent Steve Westcott, who stated, "Nobody simply going about their daily business should have to pay the terrible price which Mr. Javid has paid." Many drivers took to the streets during 2 separate demonstrations, calling for greater protection for drivers, which was combined with threats that they would go on strike if needed. In the aftermath of Tariq's death and the uproar that followed, over 300 attack alarms were issued by the police, and the council met to discuss plans to introduce surveillance cameras and GPS trackers into vehicles. They also gave drivers permission to reject a fare if they deemed that an individual was too intoxicated or were demonstrating threatening behaviour. Within days of the murder, the 3 men had been apprehended, and police began to piece together what had occurred in the hours leading up to the incident taking place. It emerged the 3 men had been celebrating Mark Baker's 21st birthday, and the trio had been drinking heavily in various pubs around Bury. Around about 5 p.m. they had contacted the offices of Peel's Taxis, who dispatched a driver to take them to their desired destination. It would be Tariq Javid, who would be assigned to the fare. According to the testimonies of the 3 individuals, a dispute began in the car, resulting in an argument between them and the driver, which continued after the taxi had stopped. During the trial, one of the defendants, 30-year-old Jason Powers, alleged that a physical altercation took place between him and Tariq, causing him to lash out at the taxi driver, claiming he only kicked and punched him in an effort to get away. Quote, "I didn't have any intention of causing him any harm. I just wanted to get away." Power continued by insisting that the injuries Tariq suffered had occurred when the 46-year-old struck his head after falling backwards. Quote, "He fell back. I got up and he was on his back unconscious, but I didn't see him hit the floor." The 30-year-old, however, conceded that his behaviour was, quote, "appalling and shameful." Despite this acceptance, Jason Power pleaded not guilty to the murder. He also denied the theft of a motor vehicle or the taking of items that belonged to the victim. However, this denial was contradicted when evidence was submitted that suggested that this defendant had used money stolen from Tariq's pocket in order to pay for a taxi journey later that day. He insisted that he was not privy to any plans not to pay the taxi fare, and that it was Mark Baker who had stolen the vehicle, which was corroborated by witnesses who saw him get into the driver's seat. Powers also claimed that Baker was the one who decided to set fire to the car. The final and youngest member of the trio was David Hawkins, who was just 17 years old, and whose involvement in the crime was not as pronounced, which led to the judge's decision to remove the charge of robbery against him. A year on from the horrific attack, Mark Baker and Jason Power were both convicted of murder, During the 6-day trial, those in the court heard testimony of the violent and senseless death of a much-loved father of 4. However, during sentencing, the judge concluded that Baker and Power had not intended to cause Tariq Javid's death, and with this, he sentenced Mark Baker to 12 years behind bars, while his co-defendant Jason Power was given 14 years. Over the years, these sentences have been reviewed, and there have been a couple of appeals. However, the judge's original terms have been upheld. Speaking to the Manchester Evening News, Tariq's wife spoke of the devastating impact his death had had on the lives of herself and her family. She told the reporter, quote, "Tariq was an honest and hard-working man who loved his 4 children and encouraged them to study and to respect others. We were a very happy and close family, but since my husband's death, it is as though we have all died. My husband suffered a violent and brutal death, and I will never be able to forgive those responsible. They have taken a father from my children, a son from his mother, a brother from his siblings, and a husband from his wife." His son Naveed spoke shortly after the trial, lamenting the fact that his father was brutally killed while just doing his job. "We are now left with the horror of our father's death on our minds, and we will always wonder if he thought about us as he took his last breath. Our father was an innocent man, just trying to earn a living, and we feel a sense of helplessness that we were not there when he needed us." Responding to the safety concerns raised by the taxi drivers in the wake of the murder, Barry's taxi licensing body authorised the installation of cameras in all vehicles. However, this would have to be paid for by the driver. But as Dr. Salim, the chairman of Barry Race Quality Council, stated, quote, "The cameras will be expensive and can cost up to £500. But at the end of the day, a taxi driver's life is more important, so we need to make sure the most effective security measures are put in." Over the years, various parts of the country have attempted a number of schemes to protect taxi drivers. For instance, following multiple attacks against drivers and their vehicles by groups of youths in Liverpool, 100 cabbies formed a blockade outside Merseyside Police's headquarters, demanding action be taken. The extent of the issue was highlighted on BBC News by Tom McIntyre, the Liverpool taxi representative for the Transport and General Workers Union, who advised, quote, "Every one of the 417 cabs in Liverpool has been hit at least once or twice. Gangs of youths stand there with boxes of eggs to throw. If they throw them over the windscreen, they can blind the drivers. What is going to happen if they then drive through a bus stop? It started with just bricks and eggs, but now it is anything. One lad had a 4-inch bolt thrown at him, which went through one side of the cab and out of the other." In response, Merseyside Police launched Operation Trojan Taxi, during which plainclothes officers would pose as taxi drivers, while another officer and a police dog handler would act as passengers, with the aim that they would apprehend those responsible for the attacks. Explaining the purpose of the operation, Chief Inspector Steve McNaughton from Merseyside Police said, "You will not know where these taxis will be. This targeting of innocent drivers who are just going about their daily business has got to stop. We are determined to stamp out this abhorrent behaviour, which is seriously affecting the quality of life for both taxi drivers and local people." Following the success of the operation at the end of 2001, Merseyside, along with other forces, would implement it over subsequent years. Earlier in 2001, and 37 miles away from the city of Liverpool, growing racial tensions in the town of Oldham had erupted into rioting on the streets, which subsequently swept to other areas of the north of England. These riots rocked the town and shone a spotlight on the issues that had been brewing for years between the white and Asian communities. A report into the cause of the riots, commissioned by the government and led by Professor Ted Cantell, concluded that the Asian and white communities in the town were living what he termed parallel lives, stating that segregation and division between Oldham's communities was deeply entrenched. The report blamed the demise of the manufacturing industries, which had resulted in poverty and deprivation. Professor Cantell recommended that efforts needed to be made to end the division in the community, by encouraging both sides to work together to create a more united society. In the aftermath of the riots, an interfaith forum was established, and the creation of a cultural quarter was commissioned, in the hope that it would bring unity to the town. However, 16 years after the riots, Professor Cantell would go on to state, quote, "The efforts at integration have been lukewarm at best and probably non-existent at worst." With the aftermath of the previous year's riots still raw, the death of Asian taxi driver Israr Hussain in 2002 would bring the issue of racism to the surface once more. The 42-year-old father of 6 lived in the Glodwick area of the town, which had been the epicentre of the riots. He would have witnessed firsthand the increasing tension and devastating fallout that followed, no doubt fearing for the safety of those around him. As a driver for A1 Euro taxis, who were based in Oldham Town Centre, Israr worked long hours, usually during the most antisocial hours between midnight and dawn. That is when it is possible to make the most money, and as such he was working on the night of Friday the 27th of December 2002. Friday nights are always busy for taxi companies. It's the start of the weekend for workers and students alike, and the festive season brings out more partygoers, meaning plenty of people needing a lift home at the end of a night out. So when a white male in his early 40s, dressed in a dark jacket, trousers and a white shirt, entered the A1 taxi's office, requesting a ride at 2 a.m. in the morning, it seemed like just another fare. The smartly dressed man asked to be taken to the Red Lion pub, a majestic 3-storey building with painted white render and black window mantles. It stands perched, with its gable end adjacent to Leeds High Street. It was a journey that would take Israr approximately 7 minutes to complete, giving him plenty of time to get back to the town centre and pick up a few more passengers before the end of his shift. As he pulled up next to the pub, his passenger handed him a £20 note in order to pay the £4 fare. Israr reached for his bag of change, only for the cold steel blade of a kitchen knife to be pressed against his neck. In the dull light of the back seat, the well-dressed man now leant forward, wielding the weapon and insisting that Israr handed over the money. The man, 46-year-old Paul Craig, would later tell the court that he only intended to rob the taxi driver, as he needed money and had concluded that a cabbie would carry excess cash at that time of year. He continued to claim that Israr, instead of handing over the money, hit him in the mouth with his microphone, splitting Paul's lip and breaking his false teeth. The microphone fell to the floor, and Paul seized his opportunity to again demand the money, lunging the knife forwards as Israr leant over to collect the microphone. Seeing the knife, the taxi driver moved in an attempt to avoid the blade, but the knife pierced the 42-year-old's neck, slicing through an artery. The father of 6 stumbled out of his car, clutching at his wound in a desperate attempt to stem the flow of blood. Craig told the court he had tried to help Israr. The taxi driver signalled for him to leave him alone, so Craig allegedly complied with his request. As his attacker disappeared, Israr took a few laboured steps before collapsing on the cold pavement. A man and his girlfriend who had been walking by stopped to assist him as he lay bleeding on the floor, with a man performing CPR until the paramedics arrived to take over. They rushed Israr to the Royal Oldham Hospital, where he would pass away at 3:16 a.m. As news of the murder broke, reports circulated the attacker was a white male, and rumours began to spread, with suggestions that it was a racially motivated attack. The police were quick to ask for calm, a plea which was backed by Mayor Riaz Ahmed, who stated, quote, "The message to the people of Oldham is to stay calm. Let's work with the police to find out the perpetrator of this heinous crime. I would urge anyone who's sheltering this criminal, or who knows who this criminal is, to come forward and inform the police." Chief Superintendent David Baines added to Mayor Ahmed's statement, quote, "People have suggested that this is a racist killing. The truth is, I don't know if it is or not, and neither does any of the police officers investigating. Until I have information or evidence that it is or is not racially motivated, I am unlikely to label it. We will view a racial motive as one possibility, but there are many other possible motives, and we will be giving each our attention during this inquiry. Despite the community being advised that they were exploring all lines of inquiry, it was clear that people were nervous, with one resident questioning the attacker's motives, quote, "Drunks don't just stab taxi drivers, do they? And what was he doing carrying a knife?" 4 days after the murder, the knife used in the attack was discovered by an 8-year-old boy just 150 yards from the scene. And just a few days later, following the release of CCTV images showing the person police were looking for in relation to the murder, they would have a major breakthrough. The police would receive a tip from a woman who would later be identified as Paul Craig's ex-wife. She gave police his name as someone who should be investigated. Following a search of Craig's home and the recovery of certain items of clothing, Craig lost his nerve and handed himself in on the 3rd of January 2003. He maintained his claim that he had accidentally stabbed Ishrar during a robbery that went horribly wrong. However, at court it was presented by the prosecution that a level of premeditation had occurred. Paul Craig has specifically chosen his smart attire to help give the appearance that he was just someone who had been out celebrating. He had also taken a knife from his kitchen, which he had sharpened earlier that day. This led to the suggestion that he intended to use it. 7 months after the murder, Paul Craig would appear at Manchester Crown Court, where he was found guilty of murder. During sentencing, Mr. Justice Gross stated, "The murder was a despicable crime involving the planned targeting of a vulnerable taxi driver. You are responsible for the untimely death of Mr. Hussain, and your actions have deprived Mrs. Hussain of a husband and 6 children of their father." The judge also took the time to highlight the efforts of Stuart Plumley, the man who had stopped to assist Ishrar, administering aid until an ambulance arrived. The judge commended his actions, calling them quite extraordinary, and as a mark of the court's gratitude, Judge Gross ordered that Stuart be awarded £500 purely as a way of thanking him for his efforts. On this occasion it appears the court went along with the narrative that Ishrar's death was the result of a robbery gone wrong, and that Paul Craig had gone out with the intention to steal money from a taxi driver that night. However, given the number of incidents that involve drivers who are from Black, Asian or ethnic minorities, it is difficult not to consider whether racism plays a factor in some of these crimes. In a response that mirrored the actions of the authorities in Bury, Oldham Council advised they would be reviewing and implementing new safety measures. Richard Knowles, the council leader, stated that, quote, "We had previously agreed that CCTV cameras and protective guards can be fitted to private hire vehicles and taxis, and would encourage operators to install these devices. The council, through the Crime and Disorder Partnership, recently allocated £15,000 towards the development of CCTV tracker systems to prevent violence against drivers, but it is only the start, and ways need to be found involving the operators themselves to raise the significant funding needed to install the necessary equipment to each taxi in the borough." The examples discussed so far are just a snapshot of the incidents faced by taxi drivers. These are some of the more extreme cases. However, every day drivers face both verbal and physical abuse from passengers, an issue which was raised by Mr. Brian Binley, a Conservative Member of Parliament, in 2008. During his speech, Mr. Binley stated that there were 3 reasons for violence being perpetrated against drivers, stating, quote, "First, taxi drivers are alone with their customers in their cabs and are therefore highly vulnerable. Secondly, drivers operate at the front line and deal with some emotionally charged and volatile situations. Thirdly, in cities and town centres, taxis are the only form of public transport available at antisocial hours." He proceeded to explain that the majority of offences occur during the night, and that there have been a marked increase in violence towards drivers since the law had allowed bars and pubs to serve alcoholic beverages on a 24-hour basis, resulting in a rise in binge drinking and incidents of antisocial or violent behaviour. Mr. Binley went on to list the implications of these attacks, stating that it wasn't just physical injuries, but, quote, "depression, death, and a massive hit on drivers' families, which must not be forgotten. He continued to highlight the extent of the issue, stating that, quote, in 2007, there were 13 murders and 60 serious assaults, as well as more than 1,000 other assaults, and those are just the reported ones. There have been 49 murders within the private hire industry over a 15-year period. Incidents of verbal and racist abuse stretch to the many thousands. Although 1/3 of taxi drivers are from ethnic minorities, 2/3 of those murders were from that sector of our community. Mr. Binley used his speech to reflect the concerns of people in the industry and describe schemes and safeguards that had been implemented. However, he bemoaned the fact that there were so many inconsistencies in what was offered in various areas of the country. He raised concerns regarding drivers' complaints about law enforcement's response to incidents, with some drivers claiming that they had to wait over an hour for an officer to respond. Another area that he criticised was the various reports that were meant to be addressing these concerns that had been started by different agencies but had not been completed, meaning that the issues were not being addressed. He called for a more consistent approach to driver safety across the country, suggesting that maybe the government could assist drivers in funding the installation of CCTV in their vehicles. He also mentioned the idea of a protective screen in private hire vehicles that could be placed between the driver and the passenger, akin to the type found in a Hackney cab or those that protect bus drivers. Since the issue was raised in Parliament, local authorities and insurance companies offer safety guidance to those in the profession. However, some of these recommendations are not enforced. Today, almost all taxis have security cameras installed, and in accordance with the guidance, the vehicles will have signage in place, making passengers aware that CCTV is in operation. They also have notices stating that there is a limited amount of cash in the car. Fortunately, with the introduction of card payments and services such as Uber, most drivers no longer have a need to carry that much cash. Another device that taxis now have installed are GPS trackers, which enable others to locate the vehicle should the driver be in trouble or if the car gets stolen. This is combined with drivers being advised to stay in regular contact with their dispatcher or other cabbies and to communicate if they have had an issue or to notify them of a change in destination. By creating a network between local drivers, they can be more aware of each other's activities and be notified if there are potentially problematic passengers. As well as communicating with others in the industry, taxi drivers are advised to interact with their passengers through both verbal and non-verbal means. For example, making eye contact, engaging them in conversations. Drivers are also made aware that courses are available to assist them in self-defense and communication skills. As stated previously, panic alarms are fitted to cars, and drivers are allowed to refuse a fare if they deem the individual or group to be a potential threat. However, the installation of protective screens between the passenger and the driver is still only a recommendation. In the last couple of years, vehicles have had temporary screens installed to comply with coronavirus guidelines, but this is one area that requires more attention. Concerns have been raised that these screens can pose a risk to the passenger should there be a collision. But somewhere there needs to be a compromise, which protects both the driver and the passenger. At the end of the day, taxi drivers provide a valuable service. They deserve to be able to conduct their work without the fear of being abused or assaulted.
Please join me next time for more It's Murder Up North.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.